All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling A Far Cry from Africa by Derek Walcott. Powerful stuff. We've got the poem itself, of course, and some background on Walcott's life, to get a sense of where he's coming from as he wrestles with some huge themes. Identity, colonialism, violence. Oof, this one's going to stay with you, especially if you're into post-colonial literature, Caribbean history, or just like poetry that really digs deep and asks the tough questions.
Yeah, it's really incredible how Walcott manages to weave in not just the historical event of the Mao uprising, but also like his own personal struggle,
Yeah.
being of both African and European descent. There's this one line he describes himself as divided to the vein, really captures that internal conflict.
Yeah, and right off the bat, he throws us into this world of contradictions with the imagery, right? He calls the African landscape a tawny pelt, which makes me think of like a lion, but then bam, blood streams, corpses scattered through a paradise. It's a lot. Kind of unsettling. What do you think he's trying to do there, just for our listeners? Like, what's the effect of this?
Oh, that contrast is so key. It's like he's forcing us to see the beauty and the violence all at once. It's not a romanticized paradise, right? It makes you question what paradise even means in this context. Like, is it a real place or just an idea imposed from the outside? Walcott doesn't give us easy answers.
Nope, he sure doesn't. And then there's that line that just chills you to the bone. That worm saying, waste no compassion on these separate dead. So cold, right? Who is this worm and why is its voice so important in the poem?
That worm, it's described as a kernel of carrion, which is just like brilliant and disturbing at the same time. Not only is it feasting on the dead, but that word kernel, it directly links it to the British military, the colonizers. It becomes this symbol of colonialism itself, the way it reduces human life to statistics. No compassion, just like bodies.
Ugh, yeah. And speaking of colonialism, this all ties back to the Mao uprising. Right? Maybe give our listeners a quick rundown of what was going on in Kenya at that time.
Sure, so picture it. 1950s Kenya, under British rule. The Kikuyu people, the largest tribe there, are getting increasingly fed up. They're being exploited, denied basic rights, and the Mao uprising was their rebellion, their fight for independence. But, and this is important, it was a brutal conflict. Both sides, the Mao fighters and the British forces, committed atrocities.
Yeah, and Walcott really doesn't shy away from portraying that. We had the image of the white child hacked in bed, which is just horrific. But then he also compares the Kikuyu to flies battening on the bloodstreams. It's a lot to process.
Right, and the way he uses animal imagery throughout the poem is really fascinating. The Kikuyu is flies, the white child a victim of savages, and then there's this ibis, this ancient African bird, like a silent witness to it all. It's reflecting how both sides get dehumanized, reduced to stereotypes.
Okay, and then there's that line, the gorilla wrestles with the Superman. I mean, whoa, what an image.
That line is huge, EE. On one level, it's about the power struggle between colonizer and colonized, right? The gorilla, representing the African people, this raw, primal force, and the Superman, the British, this supposed symbol of superiority.
But it's not just about physical strength, though, is it? There's that whole layer of ideology, of cultural dominance tied up in that Superman image.
Absolutely. It plays into those colonial narratives about Europe being civilized and Africa being savage, and the fact that it's Superman, like this pop culture icon of Western power, adds this whole other level of irony.
Like he's poking fun at the whole power structure by using these almost cartoonish figures. And then he pulls us out of Kenya completely and throws in a reference to the Spanish Civil War. What's going on there? Why bring in this whole other conflict?
I think by connecting the Mao uprising to the Spanish Civil War, another place where ideology led to terrible violence, Walcott is saying, look, this isn't just about one specific event. It's a pattern in human history, this cycle of conflict and suffering. And within that cycle, he places his own struggle, being poisoned with the blood of both.
That's such a powerful way to describe his dilemma, right? Not choosing sides, but acknowledging that inner conflict of his mixed heritage.
Exactly. He's saying, look, I can't just align myself with one side or the other. I'm carrying both histories within me. That sense of being caught between two worlds, not fully belonging anywhere, is so central to the poem.
And to make it even more complex, he's expressing all of this in English, the language of his colonizers.
Right. That choice is so deliberate, using the language of the oppressor to critique oppression. It adds a whole other layer, makes you think about the power of language, how it shapes identity and resistance in a post-colonial world.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of violence, conflicting identities, but then there's this recurring idea of Africa as a paradise. How does that fit in?
It's almost like he's playing with that romanticized vision of Africa that's been used to justify exploitation. He's making us look beyond the surface, beyond the pretty pictures, and see the reality of suffering and oppression that exists alongside the beauty.
So it's not that he's denying the beauty, but he's refusing to let it be used to cover up the ugliness.
Precisely. He's saying, hey, don't ignore those bloodstains on the tawny pelt.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to unpack. But before we do, let's just take a second to appreciate what we've already discovered here. Vivid imagery, historical context, personal struggle, all coming together to create this incredibly powerful and thought-provoking work. What really stands out to you so far?
What strikes me is how Walcott doesn't try to give us easy answers or tell us what to think. He's just presenting the complexity and inviting us to grapple with it alongside him. And it's uncomfortable, but it's so necessary.
It definitely sticks with you. And this is just the beginning of our deep dive. We'll be back in a moment to explore even more of the poem's layers and uncover its deeper meanings. Stay with us.
To really get Walcott's struggle, you got to consider where he's coming from, right? Like his own background. Growing up in St. Lucia, a former British colony in the Caribbean. So all these ideas about identity and the impact of empire, they weren't just abstract concepts to him, they were his life.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, hey, I'm not just some detached observer. I carry this history within me.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so powerful for so many people, even today. It speaks to that struggle of coming to terms with a painful past, and trying to find your place in a world that's still dealing with the after effects of colonialism.
Okay, let's go back to those images for a sec. We talked about Africa as a paradise. But how does that square with all the violence and oppression that he's describing?
That's a great question. It gets to how Europeans have often viewed Africa, right? Like this pristine, untouched wilderness, almost like a Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
And that image has been used to justify colonialism and exploitation for centuries.
So Walcott's kind of flipping that on its head, showing us this paradise that's been shattered by conflict and bloodshed.
Exactly. He's forcing us to see the gap between the ideal and the reality, and he does it in a way that's both beautiful and incredibly disturbing.
It's definitely not easy to read, especially when you think about how these conflicts are still happening in different ways all over the world. Makes you think about all the complexities of race and culture and belonging, especially in a post-colonial world.
Absolutely. And what makes A Far Cry from Africa so important is that it doesn't offer any simple solutions. It challenges us to really think critically about the past and how it shapes the present.
Yeah, we can't just ignore the uncomfortable stuff. One thing that struck me is how Walcott portrays both sides of the conflict. He doesn't shy away from the brutality of the Mau Mau fighters, but he also condemns the cruelty of the British colonizers.
That's right. He doesn't pick a side, but he's not neutral either. He's giving us the whole picture, acknowledging the suffering on both sides.
And that's where his personal dilemma comes in,
Right.
right? Like he can't fully embrace either side because, as he says, he's poisoned with the blood of both.
Exactly. He's in this in-between space, unable to fully identify with either the colonizer or the colonized. I think that's something a lot of people can relate to, that feeling of not quite fitting in anywhere.
It's like he's saying, I'm trapped in this web of history and identity, and there's no easy way out.
And that feeling of being trapped, of being torn between worlds, that resonates with so many people, even those who haven't directly experienced colonialism.
Okay, so for our listeners, why should we care about this poem written decades ago about a conflict that seems so far removed from our lives?
Because the themes in A Far Cry from Africa are timeless. The search for identity, the struggle against oppression, the legacy of violence, the difficulty of reconciling with the past. These are all things we're still dealing with today all over the world.
It's like he's holding up a mirror to humanity and saying, look at yourselves, look what you're capable of.
Right. And it's not always pretty, but it's important. If we're going to move forward, we have to face these tough truths.
So if we were to boil this down to a few key takeaways, what would they be? What should our listeners really hold on to?
Well, first, I think it's crucial to understand the historical context. The Mau Mau uprising was a brutal and complex event, and Walcott doesn't sugarcoat that. But he also uses it to explore these larger universal themes, colonialism, identity, violence.
And it's important to remember that Walcott's own background as a man of both African and European descent adds another layer to the poem. It gives him this unique perspective on these issues, but also creates this real sense of internal conflict.
Absolutely. He's caught between these two worlds, unable to fully embrace either one. And I think a lot of people can connect with that feeling of not quite belonging.
And finally, the poem challenges us to think about the legacy of colonialism, how it continues to shape the world we live in today.
Right. It's not about dwelling on the past, but about understanding how it informs our present and how we can build a more just and equitable future.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure.
Hmm.
But that's what makes A Far Cry from Africa such a powerful and enduring work of art. It pushes us to think, to confront difficult truths, to really grapple with what it means to be human.
And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. It's not just about analyzing a poem, but about sparking a bigger conversation about who we are, where we've been, and where we're going.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch on something we haven't talked much about: the structure of the poem itself. It's written in this very specific way.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, you're right. The form is important. A Far Cry from Africa is written in free verse, so it doesn't follow a strict rhyme scheme or meter, which allows Walcott to create this sense of fragmentation and disruption, mirroring the themes of the poem itself. The lines are often short and choppy, kind of like the violence and chaos he's describing.
It's like the poem itself is reflecting that fractured
Yeah.
world.
Exactly. And the lack of a traditional structure also allows for a more conversational, almost stream of consciousness style. It's like we're inside Walcott's head experiencing his thoughts and emotions as they come.
Which definitely makes it more powerful,
Hmm.
more raw and immediate.
And then there are these moments where the language gets more lyrical and evocative, almost like he's trying to capture the beauty of Africa amidst all the violence. It's this constant back and forth between beauty and brutality, hope and despair, that makes the poem so compelling.
It's a lot to absorb,
Hmm.
but it's clear that every element of the poem, the images, the structure, the language itself, it's all working together to create this really rich and layered meaning.
Totally. It's a poem that demands your attention,
Yeah.
and it rewards you for that attention with a deeper understanding of yourself and the world around you.
Okay, so we've really dug deep into A Far Cry from Africa,
Yeah.
the historical context, the Mau Mau uprising, Walcott's personal struggles with his mixed heritage. It's a lot. But as we start wrapping things up, what would you say are some of the big takeaways for our listeners?
Well, one thing that really hits home for me is how Walcott uses the poem to explore, like the lasting impact of colonialism. He's not just recounting events, he's making us confront how those events continue to affect individuals and whole societies, even today.
Right, and it goes beyond Africa, too. He brings in other examples of violence and oppression, almost like he's suggesting a pattern.
Yeah.
These things happen again and again in different forms all over the world.
Exactly. It's highlighting these universal themes: colonialism, violence, the search for identity. They're all still so relevant, shaping our world right now.
And then there's this question like, how do we move on from this?
Mm.
Is reconciliation even possible after such brutal conflicts?
That's the big one, isn't it? And I don't think Walcott gives us a clear answer, but I do think the poem encourages us to wrestle with these tough questions, to face the complexities of the past and try to work towards a future where these cycles of violence and oppression can finally end.
It's heavy stuff, no doubt, but it's so important. And I appreciate that Walcott doesn't sugarcoat anything. He shows us the beauty, the brutality, the despair, but also that glimmer of hope.
And he does it all with such amazing language. The images are so vivid. It's like you're right there with him experiencing it all.
Oh, absolutely. Like those opening lines. A wind is ruffling the tawny pelt of Africa. You can practically feel the wings, see that vast landscape. And then he slams us with these images of violence, blood streams, corpses scattered. It's breathtaking and heartbreaking at the same time.
He's a master of contrast, that's for sure. And it emphasizes that central tension in the poem. Beauty and violence, hope and despair, the past and the present. It's a tension that we all deal with in different ways, and I think that's part of what makes this poem so relatable.
We talked about how he uses animal imagery throughout the poem, right, representing both sides of the conflict, the Kikuyu and the British. But then there's that image of the ibis, that ancient African bird. It seems to be separate from all the violence. What do you make of that?
That's a good point. I think the ibis represents like this timeless presence, a witness to the cyclical nature of history. It's almost observing the conflict from a distance, almost spiritually, reminding us that these patterns of violence, they've happened over and over again throughout human history.
So like a reminder that there's something bigger going on here,
Yeah.
beyond this one specific conflict.
Exactly. And it adds another layer of complexity to the poem. It suggests that even in the midst of all this chaos and brutality, there's a sense of continuity, something that endures.
Almost like a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's still hope, still beauty to be found.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. It speaks to the power of art, the power of poetry, to help us find meaning and hope, even when faced with tragedy.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there one final message you'd like to leave our listeners with? What's the most important thing you want them to take away from A Far Cry from Africa?
I think the most important thing is to engage with the complexities of the past, even the difficult parts. If we want a better future, we can't shy away from that. Walcott's poem, it doesn't give us easy answers, but it pushes us to think critically about the legacy of colonialism, the nature of violence, the struggle for identity and belonging. And it reminds us that these aren't just abstract ideas, they're deeply personal and relevant to all of us.
That's a powerful message, and one that I think will resonate with our listeners long after this deep dive is over.
I hope so, because ultimately, I think Walcott's poem is a call to action. It's challenging us to examine our own roles in these struggles and to work towards a more just and equitable world.
And on that note, we'll leave you to
Mm.
ponder all of this, continue exploring these important questions on your own. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time.